Hello and welcome to the third webinar of the Georgetown Global Dialogues. Today we're going to be discussing the global histories of fascism with three very distinguished guests, Veronica Gago, Naomi Klein, and Kohei Saito. I'm going to start actually by quoting some very remarkable sentences from, very prescient sentences, in fact, from Naomi Klein's new book, Doppelganger, where she's talking about the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And it starts in the crowding of these two twined peoples onto this tiny sliver of territory, the wrenching intimacy of the home invasions and demolitions, the ritualistic regularity of the pummeling of Gaza, the spectacle of once stateless refugees exiling other people into the sea of statelessness, we see in hyper-concentrated form the dead end of this project that dared to call itself civilization. Because, though it may be tempting, Israel-Palestine cannot be written off as a confounding ethnic conflict between a set of intransigent Semitic twins. It is instead the latest chapter in that story of the construction of the modern world, a world that is now on fire, a world that was born in fire, a story in which we are all implicated wherever we live. It's an extraordinary paragraph, one of the many actually in the book, where we are suddenly lifted above our very noisy and messy antagonisms and shown a clean and more disturbing pattern. I mean, in this case, we are being shown an increasingly violent impasse of secular modernity. And the book, on the whole, engenders the suspicion that fascism is never not a possibility in the modern world. I mean, I remember Mussolini very famously called the 20th century a fascist century, and so it turned out to be in large parts in the 20th century. Today, we are faced with simultaneous fascist eruptions across a much broader landscape, from Latin America through Europe to Asia. We're also becoming aware of the very intricately interconnected nature of these fascisms. When you look at the interconnected histories of fascisms today, you see Hitler learning from white supremacist legislation in the United States, Hitler learning from the British Empire, seeking to recreate in the heart of Europe the British versions of racial despotism in India and elsewhere. You see India's national Hindu nationalists drawing inspiration from both Nazism and the militant versions of Zionism. Today, Modi in India, Argentina's Javier Milei, Brazil's Bolsonaro, as well as Christian evangelists, white supremacists in Europe, have turned out to be the biggest supporters of Netanyahu. So in many ways, the sort of moral fairy tales we've grown up with, that we've been told about the contemporary world since 1945, about the conflict between democracy and authoritarianism, these kinds of moral oppositions and polarities don't really explain our world anymore. And I think we are kind of all gripped with the suspicion that there is something more going on, that we resemble our supposed enemies more than we would like to think. And again, I mean, Naomi writes in a new book, the most chilling part of her doppelganger journey. It is not only an individual who can have a sinister double, nations and cultures have them too. Many of us feel and fear a decisive flip, democratic to authoritarian, secular to theocratic, pluralist to fascistic. In some places, the flip has already taken place. In others, it feels as close and as intimate as a warped reflection in the mirror. Naomi, I'll turn to you now and sort of ask you to elaborate a little bit more on this sort of extraordinary landscape that you sort of describe in this book, these various fascisms that are more than just political phenomena.
Well, thank you for having me and for convening us, Pankaj. I've so appreciated your voice in these horrific times, and Veronica and Kohei, it is so great to be in conversation with you. And I think it's really fitting because this is what is happening in Palestine, what is happening in Gaza, which is an ongoing genocide, it's part of a global phenomenon. It's part of a global hard right turn. And I think we need to look at the particularities, but we also need to look at the threads of connection, geographically, but also temporally, right? Which is what Pankaj was referring to. And I guess the way I see this moment is really a battle of dueling stories about the birth of the modern world. And the story that you referenced, the one that we both grew up with, is this idea of a European fascism as a rupture, as an exception, as something, and also the effects of which being so extreme, and so horrific, and so unthinkable, in the scale of the atrocities and mass murder, that comparing them was almost a diminishment by its very nature. And so a lot of the discourse around the Nazi Holocaust forbade comparison and even forbade understanding. I mean, if you think about Claude Lanzmann's writing about his landmark series Shoah, he adopted actually a line from Primo Levi's book, that was Primo Levi, and I know Primo Levi was such an important figure for you, Pankaj, but what was said to him when he was in Auschwitz by a guard, here there is no why. So then that forbidding of understanding that comes from the Nazi guard is then adopted by Claude Lanzmann, to say that we cannot ask a why of the Holocaust. We cannot try to understand it. And so this is the kind of ring of fire story, right? The total exceptionalization. And then there's the other story that Aimé Césaire was telling, that W.E.B. Du Bois was telling, that Nehru was telling, and I only know that because you wrote to me about it, but that saw European fascism as this kind of doppelganger twin of colonialism, imperialism, of the race science, of the concentration camps, and the return to Europe. So it's not that it's a new story; it's a story that many have been trying to tell all along, since the 30s. But it's a suppressed story, and now that story is reasserting itself. And then we see that in South Africa's case before the ICJ. We see it in Namibia intervening and saying to the Germans, you better not side with Israel, because we know that your first genocide was against the Nama and Herero people in what is now Namibia. So that other story is coming up, and I think young people are really at the forefront of connecting the dots. And so the repression that we see on our university campuses and the attacks on any kind of connection or between Indigenous people, between the Black liberation struggles and Palestine, these are really the most threatening parts of the Palestine Solidarity movement, and we're seeing the most forceful attacks on them. And of course, just this morning, a huge attack on Jonathan Glazer, the director of Zone of Interest, for daring to de-exceptionalize.
Yeah, so on one hand, you have this sort of enormous mobilization to essentially protect an intellectual political archive, particular kind of oppositions, particular ideologies, knowledge systems really thoroughly infected with ideological prejudices of this kind. And then you have, on the other end, at the same time, in a place like Argentina, Veronica, I remember you saying something about, the sort of desert campaign of the 19th century, which, resulted in a kind of genocide of indigenous peoples there, being invoked openly today. So you have this, effort to shut down voices on one side in large parts of Western Europe and United States, especially young people, as Naomi said, who are now trying to explore and bring up some of these intertwined histories. And on the other hand, you have a hard right openly asserting, openly proclaiming their support of genocidal campaigns in the past, and now sort of putting them in new political context. I mean, I'd love to hear your take on this.
Yes, thank you very much, Pankaj, for having me, and it's an honor to be here with my comrades in this event. Yes, I think that Palestine is the center of the world right now. So everything that we are thinking is connected with the genocide that is happening right now. So when we are thinking about the Desert Campaign, that it was the genocidal campaign against indigenous populations in Argentina in the 19th century, that is now celebrated by Javier Milei's allies, but also when we think in fascism in Argentina and in Latin America, our immediate reaction is also to associate it with our own experience of dictatorship. So all these histories and tragedies in our histories are connected, and we are obliged to produce those connections to produce a critical thinking about it. And now we are dealing with an extreme far-right government, which is proud that he won the election with the votes of the more traditional right-wing party. And Milei nowadays vindicates the military dictatorship of the 70s and also the Washington Consensus of the 90s, but under a programmatic form of an internet troll. So Milei is now an autocratic leader who won elections to govern by decree in order to impose neoliberal shock reforms. And we are faced also with a character who seems indifferent to criticism because he uses the tactics of an internet troll. Also, we can talk about a troll president. And we are faced also with a character who does not seek to be a champion of democracy, but to decree its irrelevance on our 40th anniversary of the return to democracy after the dictatorship. So I think that he is very proud of drawing his power directly from capital. It is the great owners who transfer their power to him, the genocidal history, but also the financial powers and also the agribusiness corporation who are supporting him. So one of the features of Milei's governance that stands out is, I think, the velocity of his ultra-neoliberal reforms that are already being implemented. And during his campaign, he promised even greater austerity measures than those demanded by the IMF. And that is exactly what he has been doing. And all these dramatic and genocidal and fascist histories are vindicated as part of the plan. So I think that he wants to start in a sort of capitalist revolution because it is located in a geopolitical moment that we are talking about, in which he wagers on complicity with Elon Musk. For example, maybe you remember the erotic entrepreneurial celebration of Milei's speech in Davos, shared on the social media by Elon Musk, that is not only explicitly disturbing, but also forces us to analyze and combat its sort of efficacy. But also, he celebrates all the time Trump and Netanyahu. So I think that we have to combine to understand Milei, this neoliberal shock with a pedagogy of cruelty. I think that this pedagogy of cruelty must be added to the shock This is a concept by the Argentine anthropologist Rita Segato. She has elaborated that concept to speak specifically of gender-based violence and sexist aggression. But today, this term, cruelty, goes beyond the vocabulary of feminism and names the type of verbal, political, economic, historic, and symbolic violence exercised by the government, and that is practiced every day on social media. It brings, for example, together forms of insult and mistreatment with the celebration of layoffs, memes that vanalize pedophilia, and at the same time, the cancellation of sexual education programs at schools. Milei himself likes in social media this kind of content, and part of the political conversation is how he pushes the boundaries of what is tolerated. So I think that the government's whole package of laws and decrees points to a logic of a predatory capitalism, symbolized by the chainsaw. You know that Milei was campaigning with this chainsaw to symbolize the velocity of the shock. And of course, the Naomi's book was very much evoked during the campaign and nowadays. And
You mean the shock doctrine?
Yes, exactly. And I think that we can analyze the current moment as a sort of renewal of counter-insurgency tactics related to an economy of obedience, boosted by hyperinflation, post-pandemic effects, and this global scenario of genocide that we were referring.
It really, I mean, this incredibly complex transactions you just described, the sort of multiplicity of factors here, it sort of makes you wonder. I mean, there's a line from Gandhi, sentence from Gandhi in the late 20s about, what do we mean by democracy? And it's something we haven't, even the word has not been mentioned before, because it seems very odd to speak about democracy in this very fraught, desperate context. But it's interesting that it said that democracy really doesn't exist in large parts of, Western Europe and United States. Whatever exists is there to cover up the incredible violence that is unleashed by this economic system that the West has and seeks to impose on the rest of the world. And one day that violence will become truly naked. So even the sort of facade of democracy will be abandoned, and we will see frankly totalitarian and frankly fascistic regimes emerge in the very heart of the modern West. And of course, that process, I mean, the first country to try and modernize in Asia was Japan. And it's fascinating how almost immediately, within a few decades of this attempt at modernization, by embracing forms of capitalism that the Japanese had seen pioneered in Western Europe, by embracing also modes of imperialism that they saw Western powers practicing in their own neighborhood, Japan plunged into this very catastrophic political phase that ended with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I want to ask, Koei, when you look at, I mean, fortunately, Japan is right now immune to these tendencies. We don't know about the future. But when you consider Japan's history in the early 20th century, what sort of lessons do you think we can draw from that history for the present moment?
Yeah, thank you for allowing me to participate in this event. And it was, however, hard for me to connect my argument with this global context of fascism, because the Japanese society currently where I am living is still missing that kind of the emergence of extreme right-wing populism. And at the same time, the left-wing politics is also very weak. And in a sense, rather the protecting the status quo, the democratic order after World War II becomes a kind of consensus of society in general. So it's not only economy is stagnating, but also politics and all the other things fortunately or unfortunately stagnating in Japan. So I wondered, before participating in this event today, I wondered how my analysis of Japanese society could contribute to understanding global rise of fascism. And I came up with this one hypothesis, and the Japanese case might be useful because Japanese society is in some sense already a fascist, or Adorno once said in the context of Germany, it's a similar, the post-war Japan made no radical break from pre-war fascist regime. So, but there's obvious one like uniqueness of Japanese fascism, and it is kind of techno-fascism, which is named by American historian Janice Mimura. And this is not like a technological fascism, but it is rather the fascism led by technocrats. So Japan or Japanese fascism was not led by charismatic leaders like Hitler or Mussolini. Mimura's hypothesis is that it was led by public servants. It is a less charismatic technocrats that actually introduced fascism because it was a more effective way of developing or modernizing Japan as a latecomer to this capitalist world order. And this is obviously led by the reform bureaucrats like Nobusuke Kishi. And after war, he became released from the Sugamo prison and became a prime minister in 1957. And together with him, he brought back all the reform bureaucrats to the power and realizing the post-war economic miracle in Japan. And Shinzo Abe, who was assassinated a couple of years ago, was the grandchildren of Abe. And so in a sense, the Japanese pre-war system led by technocrats was actually preserved as a core of post-war Japanese economic system and capitalism. And this system was very much strong in the quite recent because Abe was still very strong and popular until his death. And I wanted to claim this because why is this relevant? And I said one of the characteristics of today's fascism, which is different from 100 years ago, is that there's no strong left-wing demand for social change. So capitalism is in crisis, but at the same time, communism is no longer a threat to capitalism. So in a sense that the right-wing populism today hasn't become quite dominant because elite are still comfortable with this existing order. They don't have to introduce the classical form of fascism as a kind of emergency state or martial law of capitalism. So for the sake of protecting capitalism, liberal democracy must be sacrificed even for the elite. And that's not happening thanks to the declining of the left wing. But in Japan or in the pre-war Japan, techno-fascism was established as an alternative both to capitalism and socialism. So they argue that the capitalist competition is inefficient and the egoism under capitalism is bad. So this is technocrats introduced to a kind of planning, but that is radically also different from socialism. And this is a kind of the managerism, which is today, for example, can be found in China. So in the absence of both, or in the crisis of capitalism, but at the same time, in the absence of strong left-wing politics, I think there is a possibility that kind of the Japanese or Chinese form of techno-fascism can be introduced as a new consensus of both right-wing and left-wing people who are dissatisfied with today's existing form of capitalism.
That's fascinating. I mean, you just sort of reminded that there are so many ways in which authoritarian structures exist, establish their hegemony, and manage to persuade large populations into systems of belief, perpetuate themselves. I mean, I'm reminded, you mentioned, Kohei, the whole idea of technological or at least technology-driven fascistic systems, whereby you kind of create systems of obedience. You create, I think at some point, Veronica mentioned the sort of an economy of obedience. And that's another way in which you secure assent from, the general population, especially in kind of systems that still rely upon democracy or still rely upon elections for their particular legitimacy. There's something, I mean, Veronica, you mentioned these various sort of capturing by Javier Milei of various pre-existing discourses and their manipulation. What about climate change? I mean, what is this position on the sort of environmental movements? I mean, I would wager he's violently opposed to them.
He's a denialist of the climate change. In fact, he said that it's a sort of socialist lie. And I think it's interesting how he connects climate activism against climate change with radical feminism. He says that they are both social movements that are fighting for social justice. And that is an aberration. This is the word that he used in the speech in Davos to condemn both movements. So I think that is very well connected, this denialism of climate change, with the orientation of an extreme neo-extractivism that he's pushing nowadays in Argentina. And I think this is very much a global issue, but a very well-rooted problematic in Latin America. And I think that one other interesting thing is that in Latin America and in Argentina, the feminist struggle is also an anti-extractivist struggle. And this is very interesting because it is a material connection between gender issues and the fight against the speculation over land, and how this kind of financial speculation is translated into the food prices, for example. And now in front of our dramatic scenario of hyperinflation, especially in food prices and housing prices, these anti-extractivist struggles are very well connected with feminist struggles. And I think that when Milei is denouncing radical feminism as equal as social justice and the climate change problematic as part of this socialist lie, he's producing a very material connection between different struggles. And he's also, putting in the center of the political stage these conflicts that, at least in Latin America and in Argentina in particular, are very strong. And I think that one important element of his speech and his victory is a sort of denunciation against the feminist victories that we won, and a sort of very popular feminism that is very embedded and rooted in anti-extractivist struggles.
I mean, a lot of this is so eerily familiar if you follow Indian politics and you know what's been going on there over the last decade or so, which also just shows you that previously when I mentioned Hitler borrowing from America or Hindu nationalists borrowing from Nazism, these are instances, I suppose, of straightforward borrowings or ideological inspirations, because the world was still, a very large place back then, not so connected as it is today by, communications and sort of transport networks. But today we are looking at sort of, unprecedented synergy, many different forces coming together, coalescing to form formidable obstacles to, democracy or anyone insisting on social justice or human rights for that matter. I mean, there are so many insidious new forms of fascism in play today compared to the past. I mean, Naomi, I think in your book you mentioned, I was really fascinated by the role the wellness industry has come to play in kind of propping up old traditional family roles, insisting on the so-called naturalness of the gender binary. Would you like to elaborate a little bit on that sort of this very insidious new element now?
Yeah, I mean, both the new and old. I mean, I certainly in the Indian context, you have that sort of fusion of wellness. You've got, I think Modi I remember him putting out some yoga videos during the pandemic. And of course, European fascism was intertwined with sort of return to nature, appeals to the natural, and all kinds of strange health fads. So I think there was a separation in the post-war period of the kind of new age from the fascist right, but this is a coming together, and this discourse of purity. And I think what binds it all, I think just building a bit on what Veronica was just saying, is a toxic nostalgia for a sort of imagined past with clear, simple, dominance-based relationships inside the family and also with the natural world, right? So the father is in control of women, the children, they're not coming home from school with any troubling questions about gender. And the child is really the property of the parents. And this is where during the pandemic, I think the sort of kind of hysterical discourse around vaccines, masks, what was happening in the schools, also learning troubling histories about colonialism, all sort of converged around this save the children from different kinds of infiltration, right? Whether bodily or ideological, historical. But linking this with the climate emergency, I mean, I think about Kohei's work on growth, right? I mean, what is more threatening to this sort of capitalist masculinity than the idea of slowing down, the idea of limits, right? And so, if we think about the role of these kind of brute force technologies, whether it's mega dams, nuclear weapons, or fossil fuels, they are all these kind of assertions of one-way relationships of dominance with the natural world. Whereas any kind of ecological mindset, whether it's limits on growth, whether it's renewables that require a negotiation with the natural world, like which require that we admit that we are in relationship, are seen as emasculating. And so I think that the project, the toxic nostalgia project that I think unites so many of these different sort of faces of fascism, has to do, and why we can have this bundling together of anti-trans hysteria and climate change denial is that they are both appeals to a return of a dominance over the family and over the natural world that are really intertwined. And I think it's exciting and wonderful, and I wish we had more of it in North America, of that really solid connection between anti-extraction and feminism that is so inspiring coming from Latin America, and other parts of the world. But I think that's where the hope lies. Yeah, and Pankaj, you and I have talked about this role of injury being so intertwined with fascism, right? Back to the, if we think about the emergence of European fascism in the 30s, or it's pre-power years, you can't pry it apart from the injuries or the perceived injuries of the First World War, right? And how that kind of emasculated Germany. And what I've been trying to sort out with relation to the Zionist project is the role of lost status. Because of course, what we're talking about is the fact that though every genocide is new in particular, this was not the first time that genocidal logics, that race theory, that even technologies like the concentration camp were used during the Holocaust. They were the first time they were used against white people in Europe. But I think more than that, part of the sort of shock of it, yes, the scale, obviously, and the mechanization at the industrial scale, but also the fact that Jews in Germany were part of the club of whiteness. And I think the sort of there's a special kind of injury of being kicked out of a club, which maybe wasn't true of earlier genocides. Correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I'm sort of searching for these analogies because I think there's a particular effect of that, and it wasn't true of all Jews in Europe. There were elite Jews who very much were sort of part of the elite. There were many people who weren't. But the Zionist project was always an elite project within Judaism, within Europe. And I think that this idea that there's a reparation from genocide in being past the mantle of whiteness, and what is more proof that you're back in the club than adopting the white man's burden. And so, yeah, I'm trying to pry this apart, but I would love to hear you talk a little bit about how you see it in India and the Indian context, because there are such interesting parallels.
Well, I think the aspiration to Aryanness is very, very pronounced right from the beginning. And that's, that dates back actually to the same sort of moment in the 1920s and 30s that Hindus constitute a race. I mean, I think actually there's an interesting book on Jabotinsky, Vladimir Jabotinsky, and his ideas of race. And I think there's a parallel to be made about Hindu ideas of race, as a sort of belonging to a superior race. Whether it's coded as whiteness or in the case of India, you can't really do that, but still kind of aspiring towards, let's say, some kind of a fair skin or fair complexion, because once you start using the word Aryan, you start invoking, origins outside of India amongst fair-skinned people. So there is definitely that. There's a lot of that going on there, but I think it's interesting, the collaboration or the affiliation with whiteness, because it's very pronounced in the case of South Africa during the apartheid regime there, when the sort of mainstream Jewish organizations there chose to affiliate themselves with the apartheid regime because they were given a kind of honorary white status up above the majority population and the Indian population. Of course, there were a lot of, famously, many Jewish anti-apartheid activists who worked with Nelson Mandela and elsewhere. But on the whole, there is a very unsettling record of the local sort of Jewish community there affiliating themselves with, actually, in many cases, South African politicians who were openly inspired and pledged allegiance to Hitler in the 1930s. So there are these kind of interesting, interconnected histories of racial supremacisms. We talk about fascisms, but it may be more interesting to open up the discussion to talk about racial supremacisms as well, and how they've kind of spoken to each other across national boundaries and sort of borrowed from each other. I was going to also ask Veronica, there is that sort of moment in the sort of the sort of Argentina in the 60s and 70s there's military dictatorship, Peronism. In what way that moment resonates today? Is there a way to think about it productively? What was the sort of particular political context there that kind of incited those particular movements and those particular trends towards authoritarianism?
Yes, I think that we are now witnessing a vindication of dictatorship after a long and very brave struggle here of the human rights groups. That is a very strong tradition, especially with the mothers and grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo, who are, a global symbol of justice and memory in terms of political memory. So when Milei vindicates dictatorship, and his vice president also is a very well-known vindicator of dictatorship, because she's part of the military caste, we can say that word. Well, it is a sort of also a shock with the political tradition in Argentina, and especially with the connection between popular movement, political memory, and this sort of very, very important political exercise of rejecting dictatorship. So I think that when I was saying that Milei took office in the 40th anniversary of our democracy after dictatorship, it was a very symbolic scene, because, he took office against that tradition of democracy at the same time. But I would like also to think or to make a point around the distinction between the fascist leader like Milei and their voters. I don't think there is necessarily a direct correlation and automatic translation between his fascist leadership and the political ideologies of their voters. I think that if we accuse those who voted for Milei, it is a sort of too easy or too ineffective exercise, especially from the point of view of political organizing work. I am talking about, for example, that we are in meetings or assemblies and a lot of people voted for Milei, and they are politically organized in social movement, for example. So I think that we have to take very seriously how many people who were disappointed and angry with the state of affairs, with current political and socio-economic situation, voted for him, more as a gesture with the hope of effecting a rapid change than because they were necessarily aligned with his party politics. So I think that we have a struggle there. And the concept of a punishment vote was prevalent also with this mixture of hope of change. And Milei was very smart to take advantage, to capitalize on these people who feel voiceless, who don't feel represented by the more traditional parties, but also the people who is very disappointed and very angry with their economic situation. And the other thing that you were mentioning, Naomi was talking about, is that the Milei's government must be understood also as a challenge and reaction to the massiveness of grassroots trans-feminist struggles, very well connected with these anti-extractivist struggles. So I think that these different points about the legacy of the political memory against dictatorship, the massiveness of trans-feminist struggles, but also the urgency of the socio-economic situation for the impoverished population, especially after the pandemic, I think that there are sort of three strands of explanation that we have to connect and put together.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think, as you say, the degree of mass approval for Javier Milei should not be, should be understood rationally and calmly. There are so many reasons, there are so many factors in play here. There's so many, contexts and circumstances to understand. But I think, I mean, I'm thinking, Naomi, isn't it more disturbing when mass consent is secured for extremely violent, extreme acts of savagery? And I think this is what's most concerning about the histories of fascism. I mean, there have been mass killings and massacres, so many of them in the past, in pre-modern history, in modern history. What's specific about the mass killings of the last century or so is the degree of popular consent they managed to secure, the degree of mass participation in them, so it turns genocide or massacres turn out to be not, the doings of some deranged demagogue or some, chieftain of a cult, but more like, something that's very rationally planned and supported by people, whether expressing their approval through the ballot box or on social media. And, again, you have to wonder about how does one cope with this or deal with this particular expression of sort of mass democracy, let's put it this way, which kind of bring into question a lot of our, very sincere faith and real faith in sort of in democracy as a universal value to be upheld. I'd really love to know what you think of this.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that there has, many of us have been part of conversations for a long time about the thinness of the democracies that we were in the whole neoliberal era, the way the constraints were placed on them, and of course Argentina is one example. The dictatorship ended 40 years ago, but I remember being in Argentina in 2000, at the end of 2001, beginning of 2002, in the midst of a mass popular rebellion that overthrew, I think it was 5 presidents in 3 weeks, and everywhere there would be neighborhood assemblies and all of this direct democracy, factory takeovers, self-organization at every level of society. I'm sure Veronica remembers it very vividly. I don't know if you remember this, hearing from people about it was so striking to me, was hearing again and again, the dictatorship just ended, because there was such a collective understanding that the democracy had been so thin, that the legacies of trauma had been so severe, that this collective upheaval, and more importantly, these forms of direct democracy was really the beginning of something else. So did that happen? Well, that's a whole long story. Of course not in any of our countries. All of these democracies have been born in chains. South Africa's as well, post-apartheid. And so I think these figures offer this illusion of some kind of control, right? I mean, Pankaj, we remember the Brexit slogan, take back control. And it could be the slogan of any of these figures, even if the control is just over your family, right? And so, I think if there's no prospect of really meeting people's needs, and there is such a profound, dialectic between the sort of normalization of mass death, and here I'm not only talking about the extreme and extraordinary and devastating case of Gaza, I'm also just thinking about a sort of normalization of deaths on our streets from poison drugs, from the housing crisis, from the pandemic, and so just the kind of grinding normalization and of just like we can't solve these problems within within neoliberal politics and these very thin democracies, I think makes it inevitable for people to come along and say, well, I can offer you sadism, I can offer you control in your family, and I can offer you politics as a kind of gladiatorial blood sport. And what's the other offer, I guess, is the question, right? I don't think we can throw up our hands and say there's no hope unless we're really seeing something else on offer that would actually meet people's real needs to not live in a culture that is normalizing mass death, whether it is from poverty or climate breakdown. And this is why, when we talk about understanding a longer arc of fascism, we need to stretch that arc into the future as well as the past, as well as the pre-Holocaust, Nazi Holocaust past, into a kind of an eco-fascist future that is locked in if these logics continue to hold. So I guess that's not that hopeful an answer, but I do think that it is, that the urgency of the socialism or barbarism call, has never been greater than in this moment.
And a new sort of, I suppose, a fresher, renewed conception of the human individual, taking that conception away from ideologies of, endless growth. And, that's why Kohei's argument becomes so persuasive, because it's linked to, a new kind of perception, a new perception of human beings, and one that is obviously going to be resisted very, very strongly. Actually, there's an interesting question which actually addresses some of the things we've been talking about. You approach fascism as a modern phenomenon. If you're already moving in this postmodern era, what is the evolution you see? I suppose it is what Veronica and Naomi and Kohei have just sort of described. But Veronica, do you want to tackle this? I suppose the sheer sort of complexity of the Argentinian experience right now is an answer. But there is, with the postmodern era, the explosion of social media and a kind of flexing of individuality, a search for personal freedom that can take very distorted forms. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would say that it is well established, at least in Argentina, how the vote for Milei has a very important male component, male and young. That is also a specificity. And this is partly a reaction to feminist advances that we have achieved in recent years. And it connects to the frustration of those who are resentful of their future possibilities and humiliated in the concrete materiality of the present, about precarity that we were discussing as a main feature of the pandemic and afterwards. So I think that this kind of individualistic political subjectivation is also a challenge for other experiences. And in Argentina, as Naomi was evoking the 2001 popular uprising, there are a lot of different strategies, experiences that, for example, nowadays are in the center of the resistance. For example, neighborhood assemblies, but also feminist assemblies, unions and demonstrations, and different struggles in territories against extractivism. That is a sort of resource against this, what I would like to call plunder neoliberalism, because we are witnessing an acceleration of extractivism and also an attempt to contain despair through financialized everyday life. But I think that we are in a limit nowadays. And so we are all the time, disputing this individual subjectivation that you were talking before, and I don't want to be naive, but there are a lot of concrete struggles of solidarity, of political community that are resisting and that are, well, avoiding also different catastrophes in the territories and in social reproduction. For example, the soup kitchens in Argentina are a very important and massive phenomenon. And today, more than 10 million people eat every day in these soap kitchens that are organized, especially by women. And I think this is a sort of popular resource of collective intelligence against this logic of plunder.
I mean, there's another question related to, I think, the one issue we've kind of, I suppose, been circling around, which is that this is an impasse. This is an impasse of the modern project, the quotation from Naomi's book that I started out with, and an impasse that brings into question our existing strategies for getting out of it. I mean, the traditional strategies have been, yes, socialism, a new conception of how we organize our economies, how we organize our political systems. But is there a role? I mean, this is the question. Can religious leaders play a role as they did in the case of liberalization out of apartheid in South Africa? Is there a role for religious values, movements, principles to play? I mean, I'm interested also in Javier Milei's hostility to Pope Francis, the most progressive pope in our sort of lifetimes, and how really virulently hostile he has been, because he senses a clear adversary there to his particular project. Naomi, do you want to tackle this?
Well, I think it speaks to I think that question and also what Veronica was just speaking about the young men voting for Milei. I do believe that, without pointing fingers and recrimination, which I don't think is particularly helpful, I think I don't think the left has done a very good job of painting a picture of a future that everybody sees themselves in. Not just a future, but a good life. And this is where I think it ties in with Kohei's remarkable work on growth, that it is, of course, many people have been trying to do this, but I think we have focused on inclusion, but not really a picture of a future that feels like we would want to go there together, that feels exciting and hopeful, and is not just about righting past wrongs, but is really inclusive for everybody. And so that sort of sense of injury, I think, feels very fresh. And this sort of zero sum, if these people win, I lose, is able to get a lot more traction. So that feels very urgent. And I think that it is, I think there's a role for spirituality. And I'm not going to say there isn't a role for religion, although these days I blame religion for a lot, despite being a fan of much of what Pope Francis has done. I see these younger movements being incredibly influenced by indigenous leadership and cosmologies, and really this a worldview of relationality that goes beyond the human, that extends to the natural world. And that is a spiritual practice. Love is a spiritual practice. And I think if these movements are just materialist, they're dead in the water. I think we need to be captivating in that way and speak to people's hearts. But I'll end there. Yeah.
Veronica, do you have something to add to this?
No, I think that the feminist struggles have also this spiritual component. When they talk about well-being or social reproduction as a concrete battleground where we define how we want to live, with who, and for example, what kind of collective resources we can obtain. And I think that those kind of struggles are all the time questioning what images of desire we have. And I think that is a very open-ended question, but a very important question. And I think when we face frustration, especially of the youngest, we need to be very sincere, but at the same time, very collective in the sort of responses. So I think that that's spiritual element is very important in that sense of an element of struggle, solidarity, but also to dispute the idea of future, because otherwise the future is something that only the financial capital is taking into account.
Boy, I mean, one last comment about how, you know, the whole sort of proposal for degrowth seems to assume a sort of model of human individuality that is really invested in spiritual values of restraint, of austerity, a certain degree of, you know, frugality of the kind religious spiritual traditions in the past have advocated, and that we're not going to get to that particular model without a corresponding sort of revolution in the way we think about our lives and our role in the world, and how we relate to other people and to the natural world in particular. Would you agree with that? That there needs to be a kind of corresponding spiritual, if we object to the word religious, certainly a spiritual turn, a larger turn, and that any kind of political program that takes forward a proposal like that has to then also offer that particular notion in the way indigenous social movements have done, in the way even kind of mainstream political movement like Gandhi's anti-colonial struggle did.
Yeah, in terms of speaking of the strategy, the crisis is multi-stranded. It's the crisis of capitalism, but the crisis of ecology and the crisis of democracy. But the problem is the left wing is no longer able to connect these problems, and right-wing fascism seems doing much better in terms of connecting these elements by advocating the better golden age in the past, so going back to the old good days and so on. But left wing is quite divided, and one issue is that often the Marxism is still trapped in the idea of productivism and the paradigm of infinite economic growth. And that is very problematic because left wing in the global north is talking about, you know, protecting environment, but at the same time bringing better jobs, higher salary, more stable jobs. And that kind of vision is, of course, attractive for the people in the global north, but it can be accompanied by more imperialist, more colonial extraction of resources and energies, more robbery of land and resources in the global south. And it is really creating or strengthening the existing divide between the global north and south. And so I think one of today's minimum condition is for the left wing or for any progressive politics is endorsing this idea of degrowth. And otherwise, we cannot envision a future of care, mutual aid, and justice. And the problem is often the degrowth is accused of, as Pankaj just said, austerity, frugality, and even poverty. But I don't necessarily think that's the case. When the existing growth brought about various affluence and prosperity, it was always accompanied by the misery and exploitation, oppression somewhere else. But the problem today in the Anthropocene is that we can no longer really externalize that kind of true costs of affluence in the global south, global north to somewhere else. And even the people in the global north are starting to suffering from precarity of jobs, lower wages, but also the ecological impacts due to the climate crisis. And then now we are threatened to various kinds of fascist forms of oppression. So I would argue that by learning from different concepts of living, and this mutual learning process could lead to a better future. And I think degrowth is not necessarily have to be associated with poverty and frugality, but rather can be associated with a new form of abundance, because capitalism is really the process of enclosure and dispossessing commons. And this is still going on today everywhere by privatization and commodification. So by establishing a new forms of the commons through decommodification of transportations, education, medical cares, and these are the things that we have to really endorse after the experience of the pandemic of the COVID-19. I think it is really the way to create a new form of radical abundance based on the sharing the existing wealth without really endless competition for the sake of pursuing infinite growth under capitalism.
Well, I mean, I think I feel like we're just beginning to warm up, and this could go on forever. But unfortunately, we have run out of time. But I mean, I can't recall being involved in a more stimulating discussion than this. So thank you so much